I was looking at a statue in a major museum. Beautiful marble work, incredible detail, the kind of craftsmanship that stops you mid-stride. And the label said, "Unknown sculptor, 19th century." Unknown. Not attributed to someone, not workshop of a master, not circle of an artist, just unknown. So I started checking other statues, other museums, other collections, and I found thousands of them. Statues with no known creator, no documented origin, no provenance beyond acquired 1870s or donated 1890s. Sculptures that appear in museum catalogs in the late 1800s with generic labels like Italian School, 18th century, or French, circa 1750, or simply unknown. And here's what disturbed me. These aren't ancient artifacts dug up from ruins where you'd expect lost provenance. These are statues from the 1700s to the 1800s. Recent history. The era of documentation, catalogs, art dealers, wealthy collectors keeping meticulous records. Yet somehow, thousands of sculptures lost their identities during one specific period, 1840 to 1920, the same 80 years when everything else was being renamed, reattributed, and erased. Let me show you how pervasive this is. I went to Sotheby's auction catalog from 2016, Old Master Sale. Here's what I found. Ferrarese School, 16th century. A follower of Andrea del Sarto, Circle of Paolo Veronese, Manor of El Greco, Workshop of Lorenzo di Credi, after Sir Peter Paul Rubens, studio of follower of John Bruegel the Younger. Not one of these has a specific artist attribution, just vague categories, generic labels, ways of saying, we don't know who made this. And this isn't one auction, this is standard practice. Museums and auction houses have developed an entire vocabulary for we don't know. Circle of equals someone influenced by this artist. Workshop of equals maybe made in the artist's studio. Follower of equals someone who came after. Manner of equals stylistically similar, attributed to. Equals we think maybe possibly school of equals from the same general region / period. After equals definitely a copy. It's a taxonomy of uncertainty. And when you look at museum collections, you realize how much is labeled this way. Thousands of sculptures, paintings, artifacts, all with lost or uncertain attribution, all acquired during the same period, 1840 to 1920. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Before museums started using this vocabulary, art wasn't anonymous. Wealthy collectors in the 1700s kept detailed records. Inventories listed specific artists. Provenance was tracked meticulously because it determined value. Art dealers maintained catalogs, artists signed works, or had recognizable styles documented by contemporaries. But somewhere in the 1800s, this system broke down. Suddenly, museums started acquiring statues with unknown provenance, meaning no documented history of ownership, no record of who commissioned it, who owned it, where it came from before appearing in a dealer's showroom in the 1870s. From museum documentation, provenance research relies heavily on materials like inventories of collections, catalogs raisonnés, exhibition catalogs, and correspondence between artists, dealers, and collectors. But for thousands of 19th century acquisitions, these materials don't exist, or they were destroyed, or they were never created. The chain of ownership just stops. Let me show you a specific example. The portrait of an unidentified sitter attributed to Moretto de Brescia in the Cranert Art Museum. The back of the painting has labels showing it belonged to 1 man and 4 women during the 20th century. Genealogical research revealed these were actually one woman whose name changed through marriages. Harriet Harris to Harriet Schulte, to Mrs. Edward Jonas, to Mrs. H. Harris Jonas. That's 20th century provenance. Documented? Traceable? But before 1900? Unknown. Where was this painting before the 20th century? Who owned it? Where did it come from? The museum admits uninterrupted provenances are the exception, not the norm. The exception, not the norm. Meaning, most artworks in museums have gaps in their documented history. And these gaps disproportionately occur in the 1800s. Or consider the portrait of a girl attributed to Ambrosius Holbein. It was part of the Ambras Castle collection formed by Archduke Ferdinand II, moved to Vienna during Napoleonic Wars for safekeeping from pillaging soldiers. Entered the Vienna Kunsthistorisches Museum in the late 1800s. In 1937, the museum traded it to Amsterdam art dealer Peter de Boer. But here's the question the museum can't answer. Where was this painting between the highly problematic years of 1937 and 1940? 3 years. Missing. And that's a 20th century gap. Imagine the 19th century gaps that are even less documented. Now let's talk about reattribution. This is when a statue or painting that was labeled one way gets relabeled differently. It happens constantly. And it almost always happens to works acquired in the 1800s. Example, the Portrait of Nicholas I by Tomasz Oskar Sosnowski, National Museum, Warsaw. Except it's not Nicholas I. Archival research revealed it's actually Count Fyodor Berg, 1794 to 1874. The statue was renamed, reattributed, given a new identity. When? During the 19th century, when provenance was being established. Or the Lady Jane Maxwell painting, originally attributed to George Romney, a Romney specialist reattributed it in a recent catalog, Raisonné. Now it's considered a copy. But here's what's strange. The painting came with a pencil drawing believed to be from Romney's sketchbook, attached to it since at least 1898 as a guarantee of authenticity. Why would Romney's original drawing be attached to a copy of his painting? The attribution changed. The identity changed. But the physical evidence suggesting authenticity remained. Someone decided it was a copy. Based on what? Stylistic analysis, expert opinion, standards that changed over time. And this brings me to the most disturbing pattern. When you map out when artworks lost their provenance, when reattributions happened, when unknown labels proliferated, it all clusters in one period, 1840 to 1920. From museum documentation, provenance principles were developed in the 19th century by both French and Prussian archivists. 19th century. That's when the system for tracking provenance was formalized. That's when museums started requiring documentation. That's when professional standards for attribution were established. And somehow, that's precisely when thousands of artworks lost their documented histories. Not before, not after. And during the exact period when documentation was supposedly improving. Let me show you what happened with World's Fair sculptures. The 1893 Chicago World's Columbian Exposition featured hundreds of statues. Designed by America's top sculptors, Daniel Chester French, Augustus St. Gaudens, Edward Kemes, massive classical sculptures. The Statue of the Republic, 65 feet tall, hundreds of allegorical figures decorating the White City, and within months of the fair closing, almost all of them were destroyed. Fire, demolition, deliberate destruction. The official reason, they were made of staff, a plaster substitute for stone that was temporary. But here's what's strange. The same sculptors who made temporary plaster versions also made permanent bronze and marble versions. Daniel Chester French's Republic statue was destroyed by fire in 1896, but he later created a smaller bronze replica in 1918. Why destroy the original? Why not preserve it, restore it, document it? And it wasn't just the Republic. From museum records, within months of the fair's closing, almost all of the outdoor sculptures were destroyed by demolition or fire. Almost all of them. Hundreds of sculptures by known artists, documented at the time, photographed extensively, destroyed within months. And many of the bronze versions that survived, they ended up in museums with incomplete provenance. The Christopher Columbus statue from the 1893 fair was reportedly exhibited there, note the uncertainty, then installed on a building in Chicago, then put in storage for 7 years, then installed in a park, then vandalized in 2020 and returned to storage. Over a century, its documented history became fragmented, reportedly exhibited, gaps in the record. And this was a famous statue at a major event that was extensively photographed. Imagine the statues that weren't famous. Now, here's what museums won't tell you directly, but you can find in their documentation. Until the 1990s, provenance research was mainly conducted to determine the attribution and authenticity of an artwork. Until the 1990s. Meaning, before then, museums didn't systematically investigate where artworks came from. They accepted them, cataloged them with whatever information was provided, and moved on. And who provided that information? Art dealers, private collectors, donors. Oh, and people who had every incentive to claim prestigious provenance whether or not it was documented. For museum records, the quality of provenance of an important work of art can make a considerable difference to its selling price in the market. Provenance affects value. So dealers had financial incentive to claim good provenance, even if documentation was missing, even if the chain of ownership had unexplained gaps. And museums accepted these claims because they wanted the artwork. Then they labeled it with vague attributions. Circle of, workshop of, unknown. Not because the sculptor was actually unknown, but because the documentation proving who made it was missing or insufficient by the new professional standards. Let me show you how this created a system of controlled forgetting. An artwork appears in a dealer's collection in 1870. The dealer says it's Italian 18th century or French school, 1750. A museum acquires it in 1880 based on this attribution. But there's no documentation before 1870, no provenance, no record of previous ownership. The museum catalogs it as Circle of Famous Artist because it looks similar to that artist's style. Decades pass. A scholar studies the work in the 1950s, decides the attribution was wrong, reattributes it to unknown 19th century. Now the artwork has three different identities. What the dealer claimed, 1870, what the museum cataloged, 1880, what modern scholars decided, 1950, and the actual sculptor, lost to history, not because the information never existed, but because it was never properly documented when the artwork entered the museum system, or during the 1840 to 1920 period, when thousands of artworks were being acquired with incomplete provenance, when the professional standards for documentation were being formalized, when the institutional gatekeepers were deciding what counted as authentic and what didn't. And this brings me to the statues that got generic names. Not unknown exactly, but generic descriptive titles. The architect, the philosopher, the warrior, female figure, male portrait. Not names, not specific people, just roles. These titles appear in museum catalogs starting in the late 1800s. Before that, statues depicted specific individuals, named people, documented subjects. But in the 19th century, generic titles proliferated, sometimes because the original identity was lost, sometimes because it was deliberately obscured. Consider, a statue originally depicting a specific Tartarian nobleman gets acquired by a European museum in 1875. The dealer doesn't know, or won't say, who the subject was. The museum catalogs it as male portrait Central Asian, circa 1750. Generic, anonymous, culturally vague. The statue still exists, but its identity is gone, replaced by a description that tells you almost nothing. And this happened thousands of times. Statues from regions that were being conquered, colonized, or politically reorganized in the 1800s, Central Asia, Mongolia, Manchuria, regions previously called Tartary. Their artwork entered European and American museums during the same period those regions were being renamed on maps, and the statues lost their specific identities, just like the territory lost its name. Or now ask yourself, why don't museums investigate this? They do, sort of. For museum documentation, provenance research grew significantly after the Washington Principles of 1998 and the accompanying increased awareness of the issues surrounding Holocaust-era art theft in Europe. That's when museums started systematically researching provenance, for Holocaust-era theft specifically. Meaning, for 150 years, museums had been acquiring artworks with questionable provenance and not investigating deeply. They checked enough to avoid obvious forgeries. They verified enough to satisfy legal requirements. But they didn't trace the full history. They didn't demand complete documentation of ownership going back to the original artist. And when provenance had gaps, especially 19th century gaps, museums accepted it. Because the alternative was not acquiring the artwork. Or worse, discovering the acquisition was problematic and having to return it. Let me show you the scale of this. According to museum documentation, most of the remaining 200 or so lots at a Sotheby's Old Masters auction were of less certain attribution. Out of 200 artworks, most had uncertain provenance or attribution. That's not an unusual auction. That's standard for Old Masters sales, meaning the majority of historical artworks on the market have incomplete documentation, and museums are filled with these acquisitions. Thousands of sculptures labeled unknown, or circle of, or workshop of, thousands more with provenance gaps in the 1800s, thousands more whose identities were changed through reattribution. And nobody connects this to the larger pattern of erasure happening during the same period. The maps being renamed, the architecture being reattributed, the civilizations being forgotten, the institutional consolidation of who decides what counts as legitimate history, all happening 1840 to 1920. All affecting sculptures, the exact same way it affected maps and buildings and written records. Here's what museums admit in their own documentation. Fakes are not unknown, and finds are sometimes removed from the context in which they were found without documentation, reducing their value to science. Removed from context without documentation. That's what happened to thousands of artworks in the 1800s. Sculptures taken from their original locations, sold through dealers, acquired by museums, with no documentation of where they came from, who made them, or what they originally represented. And once that context is lost, it can never be recovered. The statue exists. You can see it, touch it, measure it. But you don't know who made it, who it depicts, what it meant in its original context. The physical object survived, but its identity was erased. And this is where the pattern becomes undeniable. The same period that saw maps renamed Tartary to Turkestan, Mongolia, Manchuria. Architecture reattributed, Tartarian buildings to inherited, found, unexplained, books destroyed in library fires across Europe, Historical narratives standardized by AHA and educational institutions. 100,000 plus people isolated in utopian communities. 250,000 children on orphan trains, disrupting family heritage. Massive Americanization programs erasing immigrant cultural memory. Also saw thousands of sculptures losing their provenance, museums filling with unknown and generic attributions, reattributions changing who made what, World's Fair statues destroyed within months of creation, professional standards for documentation. Emerging precisely when documentation started disappearing, art dealers controlling the narrative of where artworks came from, all between 1840 to 1920, all happening simultaneously, all resulting in the same outcome: lost identity, erased origins, forgotten creators. Now go to any major museum, look at the sculpture galleries, count how many labels say unknown sculptor, circle of artist, workshop of artist, attributed to artist, Italian school 19th century, French circa 1750. Count how many have acquisition dates in the 1870s to 1920s. Count how many have provenance gaps in the 1800s. You'll find hundreds in every major museum. And nobody asks why. Nobody questions why so many artworks lost their identities during one specific period. Nobody connects it to the broader pattern of cultural erasure, because these are respected institutions, official museums, professional curators, making decisions based on established standards, standards that were created during the exact period when the erasure was happening. Here's what a museum archivist wrote. The back of a painting is like a passport, collecting evidence of its journeys as the painting was acquired, transported, and exhibited. Like a passport, documenting where it's been, who owned it, how it moved through the world. But what happens when the passport has pages torn out? When the record of ownership stops in 1850 and doesn't resume until 1880? When the labels on the back contradict each other or disappear entirely? The museum says, uninterrupted provenances are the exception, not the norm. The exception, not the norm. Meaning, it's normal for artworks to have missing documentation. It's expected for provenance to have gaps. It's standard for attribution to be uncertain. And these gaps, these uncertainties, these missing pages in the passport, they cluster in the 1800s, during the exact period when everything else was being systematically erased, renamed, and reattributed. So now ask yourself, how many sculptures in museums today were originally labeled with specific artists and subjects, but those labels were lost or destroyed or deliberately removed during the 1840 to 1920 period, and replaced with generic attributions like unknown or circle of or regional/temporal categories, not because the original information didn't exist, but because the provenance standards were being formalized precisely when the documentation was disappearing. How many statues depicting Tartarian subjects, made by Tartarian sculptors, or representing a civilization that was being erased from maps, ended up in European and American museums in the 1870s to 1890s, with dealers who couldn't or wouldn't document where they came from, and museums that cataloged them with vague geographic labels and generic titles, preserving the physical object while erasing its identity? The evidence is all there. In museum catalogs, auction records, provenance research, professional documentation, thousands of artworks with lost or uncertain attribution, provenance gaps clustering in the 1800s, reattributions changing identities, generic labels replacing specific ones, World's Fair sculptures destroyed within months, professional standards emerging when documentation started disappearing. It's not hidden, it's just not connected. Nobody looks at a statue labeled unknown sculptor, 19th century, and asks, unknown to whom? Unknown when? Unknown because the records were destroyed, or because nobody bothered to document it, or because someone deliberately obscured the origin? Nobody questions why the same institutions that standardized historical narratives also set the standards for art provenance. Nobody asks why both systems were formalized during the same 1840 to 1920 period when Tartaria was disappearing. But the timeline matches, the methodology matches, the outcome matches. And when you walk through a museum and see statue after statue labeled unknown, you're not seeing the limits of historical knowledge. You're seeing the result of systematic erasure, physical objects preserved, identities destroyed, just like the maps that still show the territory but remove the name, just like the buildings that still stand but lost their documented origins, just like the books that were reprinted but with authenticated manuscripts only. The statues are there, but we don't know who made them, and that's not an accident.